Anis, you can stop the slides. We'll start off. Yalimadat, everybody, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, and Yalimadat to entire Jamaat, thank you once again for joining this webinar in large numbers. And I do hope all of you are safe and taking care of yourselves and your families. And welcome you all to the third version of our Udaan series on studying in Canada that we are doing in collaboration with AKEB Canada. So we had the first session by Khatija Jeta where she spoke about the overall process for applying for your higher education in Canada. The second webinar we had with Anis Ali and from the Canada APB team, and they spoke about the financing and scholarship options. And today the topic we are going to talk about is possibly the most important topic and perhaps the one with the most nuances and one where there is a lot of information required. So we are very proud to have this session and brought to you in collaboration with AKEB Canada. And before I get into introducing the speaker, a couple of housekeeping announcements as always. We will be the speaker will be presenting for about 45 minutes, and you can put in your questions in the Q&A box in the Zoom window. We'll be coming to your questions at the end of the webinar, so don't worry if your question is not answered. We'll come to you at the end, and we'll try to make sure a lot of your queries are answered. If they are not answered, you did see a slide deck talking about an Ismaili help desk and a special help desk created for information related to studies abroad. So you can put in your queries there and we will come back to you with those queries. We have a team of experts to address those queries. So with that, I'd like to present to you the third topic, which is about maintaining your status as an international student, which I think in today's times is an extremely relevant and important topic. And we are very privileged to have with us Ziah Samar, who is going to be our speaker for today. A brief introduction about Ziah. She's a Canadian immigration lawyer, barrister, and solicitor, and a partner with Long Mangalji LLP. Ziah is an active member of Canada's legal and immigration communities. She is a specialist in providing immigration planning strategies to large MNCs as well as the small and medium-sized enterprise sector. She's conducted informational presentations on immigration programs and has been invited to present across Canada and in the United States. As a lawyer, she has argued in federal court, in the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, and stands as the citizenship and immigration lead and subject matter expert for the settlement portfolio of the Ismaili Council for Ontario, and also the National Settlement Portfolio for the Ismaili Council for Canada. She's also an executive committee member of the Citizenship and Immigration section of the Ontario Bar Association. So Ziah, a very warm welcome to you on behalf of Education Board. A very big thank you to you for giving us your valuable time, and over to you for your valuable insights.
Thank you so much, Sohail, and Yalimadat, everyone. So like Sohail talked about, today we're going to be discussing the process of applying for your study permit, coming to Canada, and then of course, once you're here, maintaining your status as an international student. So before I get into that, I do want to just set the context with a bit of an overview in terms of immigration. Okay, so in Canada, we have three types of statuses. You have temporary residence, permanent residence, and then of course, citizenship. Now, our focus today is going to be on temporary residence, but not all types of temporary residence. We're focusing on one specific aspect of temporary residence, which is international students who hold study permits. Okay, so the overall area of temporary residence encompasses individuals who have come to Canada as a visitor, international students who have study permits, and foreign workers who have work permits. Okay, but today's focus is going to be on study permits. So first, how do we get a study permit, right? So we've made the decision that we want to come to Canada to study, and now we want to talk about, you've heard in the last two webinars about picking a school and how to fund that school. But now, of course, the next step is getting that study permit so you can actually come to Canada. So first of all, what is a study permit? Okay, a study permit, it's a document that's issued by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. And this is the government body that deals with immigration in Canada. And the study permit is the document that permits foreign nationals to come to Canada and study at a designated learning institution. Now, very important here, a designated learning institution is a school that has been already approved by the government to host international students. Okay, so you can only get a study permit if you have, or if you will be studying at a designated learning institution. Now, IRCC, Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, has a list of designated learning institutions on their website. Okay, so as we're going through the presentation today, you'll hear about the process and that you need an acceptance letter. When you're going through all of this, you do also want to keep in mind that we are referring specifically to designated learning institutions. Okay, so not any school, but one that has been already approved by IRCC. Now, with that in mind, it is important to also understand different concepts. Okay, so there's a difference between a visa and a permit. So a temporary residence visa is an entry document. Okay, the visa is the document that allows you to board a flight and come to Canada. Okay, now certain individuals require a visa and other individuals require what's called an electronic travel authorization. And the difference between the two is the application process, unfortunately. But who requires which is dependent on the country of citizenship. Okay, so right now, if you're holding an Indian passport, you do need a visa. Okay, and so that is a sticker that goes into your passport. It's issued again by IRCC, goes into your passport, and it allows you to board a flight to Canada. On the other hand, we have the study permit, right? The permit itself is what gives you status in Canada. Okay, so the visa is the entry document. It allows you to fly to Canada, board a flight to come to Canada and enter Canada, whereas the permit itself is what gives you your status while you're physically in the country. Okay, so two very different documents. Okay, while you're in Canada, the visa is not as important. The visa is really just for traveling purposes. Okay, so one is your entry document and one is your status document. The way I like to think about it is the visa is like a key. It allows you to enter the country. Okay, but the permit is what gives you status while you're here, while you're physically residing in Canada. So keep that in mind. When you apply for your initial study permit, IRCC actually processes both the permit and the visa at the same time. Okay, so when we go through the process, you'll see that when your application gets approved, what you get or what you get requested for is your passport so that they can enter the visa into it. And then the permit is what you'll receive when you physically arrive in Canada. Now, there are some exceptions to requiring a study permit to study here. Okay. Some of the more common ones is if you're doing a short-term program. So if your program in Canada is 6 months or less, or if you're a minor child. Now, with that being said, COVID has obviously changed this a little bit. With the current travel restrictions, even if you're planning to come to do a short-term program, unless you're exempt from the travel restrictions for some other reason, you would require a study permit in order to board the flight, even if you're coming for a short-term program. Okay, so the reality has been over the last year that students, even if they're only coming for a short-term program, still required to get that study permit, even though pre-COVID they would have been exempt from that requirement. With regards to minor children, it really depends on the age. And so basically children don't require study permits to attend elementary school or secondary school. It's only after when you're going to post-secondary school that you do require a study permit. But again, we'll get into this in more detail when we talk about accompanying family members. So let's look at what's required to apply. Okay. The first thing is, before you can even start the application process, the first step is to get accepted into a program at a designated learning institution. It's only after you've received the acceptance letter that you can actually submit the study permit application. Okay, so the first step is applying to the school, getting accepted, and then looking to apply for your study permit. Another big part of the application is your funds, right? So demonstrating that you have sufficient financial savings or sufficient financial resources to fund the program that you're coming to Canada to study in. You need to be able to provide to or prove to IRCC that you can support yourself and any accompanying family members that are coming with you while you're in Canada. Now, the exact amount that you need to be able to show depends on a couple of factors. It depends on the program that you're studying in, the school that you're studying at, the size of your family. The rule of thumb that we go by is that you want to think about what your tuition amount is. And then on top of that, for yourself, you need to be able to show at least 10,000 Canadian dollars for year one, okay? And then for your first additional family member, it's an additional 4,000. And then every additional family member on top of that is an additional 3,000, okay? So let's put some numbers to this. Let's say that our tuition is 15,000 Canadian, and we're coming as the student and a spouse. So we're looking at 15,000 for the first year tuition, 10,000 for that first family member, which is the international student, and 4,000 for the spouse. Okay, so 14,000 in living expenses and 15,000 for tuition. This is the amount that I would need to be able to show when I'm submitting my application for a study permit. Now, if you're doing a program that's multiple years, so let's say you're doing a 2-year or a 3-year program, and tuition is 15,000 per year, that doesn't mean that you have to be able to show tuition or savings of your tuition for that full 3 years when you're applying for your initial study permit. The rule is that you have to be able to show that first year. Okay, without a doubt, you have to be able to show that first year. And you have to be able to show that there's a reasonable prospect for you to have the financial resources for you to continue studying in subsequent years. Okay, so you don't have to show the full 3 years tuition or 3 years living expenses in that initial application, but the IRCC officer will want to know that you have the ability to obtain the funds in year 2 so that you're able to continue studying. Okay, so they're looking to see, do you have a reasonable way of supporting yourself beyond year 1? Okay, and generally officers want to see that you're able to do this without working in Canada. And we'll talk about the ability to work, but they're generally looking and seeing, okay, does an individual have the ability to support themselves financially, even if they're not working here at all? The other part of your application is that you have to have both an intent to study in the program in Canada, and you have to be able to demonstrate that you have an intent to follow the immigration laws of Canada. And this includes leaving Canada if your status is not extended. So at the end of your period of authorized stay, if you haven't extended your status, if you haven't been able to extend your status, IRCC wants to see in that initial application that they believe that you have an intent to both study and follow immigration laws. It's a very important part of the application, and it's really one that officers do focus on. In my experience, we see that a lot of rejections will actually fall into one of these categories, okay? And it's really because it's very subjective on the officer, and that kind of puts more of a burden on the applicant to ensure that you're demonstrating in your application that you meet these 2 criteria. You know, the first 2 that we talked about, they're a lot clearer, right? We can show the acceptance letter, it's a piece of paper. We can show the funds, it's, you know, bank statements, or it's whatever scholarships you may have. That's very objective, right? We have that to very clearly demonstrate. However, with the intent, this is where it becomes more subjective and can be a little bit more difficult, which is why we see a lot of applications being refused on these 2 criteria. For the intention to study, you want to be able to explain to the officer why you want to study this particular program and why you want to study in Canada particularly, right? So the officer's looking to understand how you came to the decision of choosing the particular program you did and why you chose Canada specifically, okay? So we normally advise our clients to provide a study plan. So that includes the process of how you got to selecting this program, how you learned about this program, why you chose Canada specifically, and how this program or how you're going to be enhancing your career goals by completing this program in Canada. This is particularly important for individuals who have had long breaks from the last time that they studied. Okay, so some individuals will take a break. Let's say they finish grade 12, they're not going directly into post-secondary, or they're now coming for a master's program. So they've done their initial degree, worked for a number of years, and now want to pursue further studies. Well, long breaks can be problematic for applications, and that's why it's really important to ensure that that break is explained and it is included in your study plan to say, why now? Why do you want to go back to studying at this point in time? Other individuals will be switching careers. And again, it just goes back to putting into that study plan why you've now decided to go back to school. With regards to the intention to comply with Canadian immigration laws, it's not necessary that you have to show that you don't have an intent to reside in Canada permanently. We do have dual intent provisions, which means that you can still have an intent to eventually become a permanent resident or a citizen of Canada. However, when the visa officer is reviewing your application for a study permit, they want to be able to see and believe that if your status was ending, that you would exit Canada. Okay, and so what they're doing here is they're evaluating your ties to Canada versus your country of citizenship. They're looking at, if you have a past travel history, that's always helpful because it shows that in the past you've complied with immigration rules of other countries. That's not to say that if you haven't traveled in the past that your application would be automatically refused, but it is helpful in application to, again, it goes to your intent, it goes to your past history. Okay, so let's talk about how we go through this process. Okay, so we've said before, the first step is to apply to a school here, to be accepted into a school here, right? So once you have your acceptance letter, that's when our immigration process begins, right? You've gone through the school process, you've picked your program, you've picked your school, and now you're applying for your study permit. Now, my expertise is certainly not in available programs or schools. I know you've done the last 2 sessions that have covered that, but from an immigration point of view, there are a couple things you want to keep in mind, okay? And again, this goes to being able to explain in your study plan. And again, it goes to your intent to study in Canada that we just talked about. You want to think about why you've selected a particular program. Okay, so when you're looking at programs here, it's not just about finding one that, any program so that you can come to Canada and get your study permit. You have to be able to explain to an officer, right, in that study plan that we've talked about, why you've picked this program. So you should really be evaluating how that program is going to help your career, right? And what your long-term goals are and where this particular education piece falls into that career plan that you have for yourself. An important note when you're looking at schools, right, and programs themselves, one, we talked about that it has to be a designated learning institution. But the second part is that you also want to make sure that the program is not one that can be completed by distance learning. And what I mean by that is online courses. Okay, so if a program normally is done by distance learning, so completely that program is online, then it actually will not qualify for a study permit. Okay, so it does need to have some in-class component to it. Now, of course, COVID has turned that around a little bit, and we will talk about that in a bit. But generally, if that program before COVID was completely done online, then it wouldn't qualify for a study permit. IRCC has a document checklist online. Okay, they publish the checklist of documents that they need in order for the application to be considered complete. Now, this lists all the required forms and the documents that are at a minimum required for the application. So if you miss a form, if you miss a document, that's a mandatory document, then your application will be considered incomplete and will be rejected. Okay, so it won't be processed. But it's very important to understand that I'm emphasizing the word at minimum here. Okay, if you have all the documents and forms that are listed on the checklist, you have a complete application, but that doesn't mean necessarily that your application will be approved. It's important to ensure that your application package addresses all the factors that the officer is looking for when they're evaluating your application. And we talked about this in the previous slide, but again, they're looking at why you've selected this program, how it's going to help your career. So in other words, what are you planning on doing after you finish this program of study? They're looking at how you're going to financially support yourself. Are you going to comply with immigration rules? And then what are your ties to Canada versus your country of citizenship? So the checklist is a good starting point, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this is the only documents that you should submit. You want to ensure that your application clearly addresses all these factors that we've been talking about. You want to make sure that it is demonstrating to the officer that you meet all the criteria that the officer is looking for. That's what makes a successful application. Okay. And with that in mind, when you're looking at the document checklist, keep in mind that there may be two that you're looking at. Okay. So there's the general one that IRCC publishes with their instruction guide. But you also have to look at the country-specific document checklist for where you're applying from. Okay, so India definitely does have a country-specific document checklist. So you want to open up both of those checklists and ensure that you're meeting the criteria and meeting all the required forms and documents on both of those lists. Then, once you have your full application, right, you've gone through it, you've double-checked all your forms, you know your documents are ready and that they address all the criteria that we've been talking about. The next step then is to submit your application online. Okay, submit it online, and then it's a matter of a waiting game until IRCC gets back to you. For this year, IRCC recently announced, actually at the beginning of the month, that any applicant who applies with a complete application before May 15th will for sure get a decision by August 6th. And so this is to allow individuals sufficient time in order to travel to Canada, meet the current quarantine requirements, and start school by the time their program begins in the fall. Now, applications that are being received after May 15th, IRCC has said that they will do their best to process in time, but again, they're not guaranteeing it. I think right now, because we're talking about the fall semester, it is one of their busiest times. And so, it is important to be thinking about applying early whenever you're thinking about starting in the fall semester, because this is when a majority of the international students are applying to start in Canada. After you submit your application online, it's a matter of, like I said, waiting for IRCC to get back to you. One correspondence that you do generally receive, if you haven't done it in the past, is your biometrics, right? So this is where you need to go into an office to actually provide your fingerprints and your photo once you've received that request letter from IRCC. And then in other cases, you do get other request letters too. So it's just, it's important to be constantly monitoring your online account to ensure that any correspondence that you do receive from IRCC, you're actioning on a timely basis, because a lot of these will also have time restrictions in terms of when they want a response or when they want that document completed by. When your application is approved, you get a request for your passport. Right, so that's a wonderful day when you get a message from IRCC, you log in and you see that it is actually your passport request. That means that your application has been approved, and IRCC is now asking for your original passport so that they can enter in, that they can put in the visa, right? So that's that entry document that we talked about. Once you've sent in your passport, you get it back, and then you're ready to travel to Canada. When you're traveling to Canada, a couple things that you need to have with you. You need to make sure that you're carrying your letter of introduction and proof of enrollment at your school. So the letter of introduction is actually a letter that comes in, again, to your IRCC, ICIC account. And it's basically saying that your study permit has been approved. The reason that this is important is that when you're traveling to Canada, when you arrive at the airport, that's when you get your physical study permit itself. And the officers are looking for that letter of introduction in order to be able to issue the study permit. So that's the process in a nutshell. Okay, so in terms of going from your application process to the study permit when you arrive in Canada. In the preparation of your application, it is important to think about some of the, to ensure that you're including some very important documents. Okay, and we've kind of touched upon these when we've been talking about what is important for an application, what an officer is looking at, but we'll go through them again. Important to have your acceptance letter, right? You can't be applying for a study permit without the acceptance letter from a designated learning institution. Sufficient funds, right? So we've talked about what amounts you need to be able to demonstrate. When you're preparing and submitting your application, you want to ensure that the documents that you're providing clearly demonstrate that you have access to the required amount of financial resources for that year one. Okay. If you're using bank statements, for example, they need to be in your name. You need to be able to show that you have access to that savings. It can't be in the name of your parents. It can't be in the name of some friend. It has to be an account that's in your name. Okay. Could be a joint account with a parent, which is fine. It shows that you both have access to it, but you do need to be a listed account holder in the statement that you're providing. Okay. If you have a scholarship, you want to provide proof in your application that you have that scholarship is not conditional on anything, or if it is conditional, that you meet those conditions, right? Again, the officer is looking to determine that you have access to the resources you need in order to complete year one. Study plan or your statement of intent, right? We've talked about, when we were looking at the important aspects of a study permit application, we talked about the intent to study in your program in Canada, and we also talked about the intent to comply with immigration rules, right? And this is where you can demonstrate, especially with the intent to study in Canada, you can demonstrate that through your study plan. So with our clients, like I said, we always prepare a statement to include in their application, which goes through that background. It goes through what they've studied in the past, what they want to do with their career, and how this program is going to assist them on that pathway. Depending on where you're applying from, and again, this goes back to that the specific country document checklists, you may or may not be required to provide language test results with your initial application. Okay, same with police certificates. This is all dependent on what or where you're applying from. Okay, medicals may be another required document. Now that depends on where you have resided in the last year. So IRCC looks at your countries of residence over the last year. So if you have spent 6 or more months in a row in a listed country, and this is all found on IRCC's website. If you've spent at least 6 months or more in a row in one of the listed countries in the last year, then you require medicals as part of your application. And India is one of those listed countries. Now, with the general study permit application, you don't necessarily have to provide medicals up front. I generally do recommend it because it means that your process, you don't have to wait to provide medicals afterwards, but it's not a mandatory part of your application if you're applying through the general streams. With that being said, if you don't include it in your initial application, IRCC will request it as they're going through the review of your application. And what that will mean is that there's now a period of time where they've requested it, you have to book a medical exam, you go in and take that medical exam, and then the results get uploaded to your application. And so there is that additional period of time where you're going back and forth to get that request for medicals, complete the medicals, and then have them attached to your application. So generally, I try and recommend clients to do it in advance so that we're decreasing the processing time. But of course, that's not always a possibility, and that's okay if you're trying to apply through the general stream. There is also what's called the student direct stream. Okay, the difference with the student direct stream is that it is a faster processing time for study permits. Most applications that are processed through the student direct stream are within 20 calendar days. okay? And now to qualify for the student direct stream, you have to be a legal resident and living in one of the listed countries. And India is, of course, a part of that list that qualifies for the student direct stream. The biggest difference between the regular stream and the student direct stream are the documents that are required for submission with your initial application. So we've talked about the documents that you need at minimum in the general application process. If you're going through the student direct stream, there are additional document requirements for students. You have to be able to prove that you've already paid your tuition for your first year. Okay, so with the general program, we said that you have to have access to it, that you have to have the resources available to you. But for the student direct stream, officers want to see that you have actually already finished paying that first year tuition. So you're looking at including a receipt or any sort of proof that the school has provided you to show that that first year's tuition has been paid in full. For your living expenses, again, they're not looking at just your financial bank statements, for example. You have to have what's called a guaranteed investment certificate. So this is through one of the listed banks. Okay, you're basically getting a GIC through the bank, and at minimum, the amount of the GIC has to be 10,000. Okay, and what the GIC is basically it's a guaranteed disbursement that you get every month, or I think it's bi-monthly as well. It comes out in installments. So you pay into the GIC 10,000, and it comes back to applicants on a monthly basis while you're here in Canada, while you're studying. So the idea behind it is that it's showing the officer that you've already put aside this 10,000 completely for the purposes of your living expenses, and you only have access to it after you've arrived in Canada, and you are now getting it on a regular basis for the purposes of paying your living expenses while you're here. And so this is a great way of demonstrating that, again, to the officer that you meet the proof of funds, and it's not going to be an issue for you to be able to fund your first year here in Canada. Now, this still means that you have to be able to demonstrate that you have reasonable basis of being able to financially support yourself in the further years of your program. But for that initial application, it's that the proof of your first year tuition has been paid and that you have a GAC of at least the 10,000. Medicals, if it is a requirement for you to have medicals, and like we said, it is for Indians that are currently residing in India, then you have to have your medicals completed at the outset of your application. So in the regular stream, we said that, if you can't complete your medicals before you submit your application, it's not an issue. You'll get a request for your medicals. Well, with the student direct stream, it is absolutely mandatory that those medicals are completed in advance, and you have to provide proof that you have completed those medicals when you submit your application through the SDS. Police certificates, again, it goes back to the country-specific checklist. If they are a requirement, then you do need to have them with the initial application. And then you have to have your most recent transcripts. So whenever your last completed education was, you would have to provide transcripts from that particular program with your application to the SDS. And then lastly, language test results. Okay, again, we saw this to be a potential requirement on the regular stream, but here on the SDS stream, it is a mandatory requirement. And you have to be able to demonstrate that you've received at least a CLB 7 on all 4 areas of that language test. So generally, you're looking at completing the IELTS general test, okay? And very important here that IRCC is looking for the general version of the test and not the academic. So on the IELTS general test, you have to be able to demonstrate that you have received at least 6 in each category. So reading, writing, speaking, and listening, you need a minimum score of 6 in order to qualify in the student direct stream. So let's talk about family members. Okay, so when you're applying to come to Canada, when you're applying for your study permit, you don't necessarily have to apply. It's not just you that can come, okay? The entire family unit can come with you. Now, when I talk about a family unit, I'm referring to spouses and dependent children, okay? So if you have a spouse, if you are married, or if you have a common law spouse, that spouse can accompany you to Canada. the spouse is eligible for what's called an open spousal work permit. So this is a work permit that allows that individual to come to Canada and work in any occupation and in any location. So there's no restrictions on that work permit for the spouse. Dependent children can go to public school for free. Okay, so there's no additional costs for dependent children to go and attend any sort of public school here. Now, you can apply for the entire family at the same time. Okay, so your initial application, if you're all planning on coming together, can include the entire family unit together. Okay, but if one thing you do have to keep in mind is the age of the dependent child. Okay, now when I say dependent children, what IRCC refers to when they're looking at dependent children is children under the ages of 22. Okay, so for the purposes of immigration, a dependent child is a child that is under the age of 22 and that is not married. Okay, so if your child is over 22, then unfortunately they wouldn't be a part of your application. The second part to it is what you're applying for. So we said earlier that children can apply, can accompany you, they can come to here and study, and they may not necessarily need a study permit. Well, when you're applying online, the age of the child determines whether you're applying for a visitor visa or a study permit for them. If the child is under 5 years old, then you can apply for a visitor visa for them, no problem. If the child is 5 years or older, then generally we're applying for a study permit for that dependent child as well as an accompanying child. And so they don't need to have their own acceptance letter. They don't need to have anything that, they don't have to have the specific documents like a study plan that we saw for the principal applicant, but instead you're demonstrating that they're a dependent child that's accompanying, but they are getting their own study permit, which will allow them to study at any elementary or secondary school. Again, once they're hitting the age of 18 or 19, depending on the province that you will be residing in, they're no longer considered a minor anymore. And so it would be mandatory at that point for them to have a study permit. And then when they're transitioning into post-secondary school, then they should be looking at getting a study permit for that particular school and for that designated learning institution. Now, all of that so far has really just been about general application processes, okay? With COVID, it has been a little, there have been changes over the last year, okay? And it is important to keep that in mind for any of you who are looking to come for this fall semester. IRCC hasn't yet, I mean, they're changing the rules, they're changing the processes, and they're changing policies all the time. Right? Immigration is a constantly evolving area of law. And especially right now with COVID, we're constantly seeing different measures being put into place to address travel restrictions and travel requirements. And of course, right now we do see that there's currently a restriction on direct flights coming from India. But with that being said, we do also want to keep in mind that, you know, potentially by September, hopefully they will have changed, but today, right now, aside from the flight restrictions that we see in place directly from India, there is additional requirements as well for international students. So for an international student to be able to travel to Canada as a student, okay, and again, this could change before September, but today they do need to have either a valid study permit or a letter of introduction. Right? So this means that they have already applied for and been approved for that study permit. A student also needs to be able to show that they are attending a designated learning institution that has a COVID plan that has already been approved by the province. Okay, so in the early days of COVID last year, between March to about the summer's period, there was a complete ban, right? So anyone who had been approved for a study permit still wasn't able to travel. Then we saw IRCC implement this COVID ready plan for the schools. And once the school had the COVID ready plan, that's when they would be able to allow international students that were coming for that particular institution to board flights and come to Canada. So important to keep this in mind in case we do see this again, or if we see this continue until the fall semester. Right now, the general travel requirements, and this is not restrictive to only international students, it's for anyone who's looking to travel to Canada at this point in time, before flying to Canada, so before boarding the flight to Canada, a COVID test has to be undertaken within that previous 72 hours. Anyone who's traveling does need to have a government approved hotel booked for at least the first 3 days of their entry into Canada. Because what happens is when you arrive in Canada, at the airport, you're doing a second COVID test, and you're basically required to stay in that government hotel until you have the results of that second test. And then there's still the requirement for that complete 14-day quarantine. So we see the first 3 days at the government approved hotel, but you do also need to have a plan for the remaining 11 days of that quarantine period. And before coming to Canada, you do have to actually download the ArriveCan app and submit your quarantine plan through that application. Now, again, this is how it is today. These are the requirements today, but by September, we may see changes. We may see different processes in place, especially with for individuals who have both vaccines potentially. But again, right now, this is what the requirements are. So we've talked about the application process. We've now gotten our study permits approved, and we're traveling to Canada, right? The next step then is, once you're in Canada, how do you keep your status, right? The first hurdle is getting that study permit. But once you're here, you want to ensure that you're maintaining your status, that you have always kept a valid status throughout the duration of your time in Canada, especially if your end goal is to be applying for permanent residence and living in Canada on a long-term basis. And so I do want to spend a couple minutes just going through what that means and what that process looks like while you're here, what your requirements are. So a study permit itself has conditions that are listed on it. So certain conditions are written onto that physical study permit itself. And when you arrive in Canada, that's when, like I said earlier, you bring your letter of introduction, and the officer at the border gives you that physical study permit. So certain conditions are obvious, right? They're written right onto that permit, like your expiry date, for example, right? That study permit could have been issued for a year, 2 years, 3 years, depending on the length of your program. But it is important to keep the expiry date in mind, because while you're here in Canada, you want to ensure that prior to that expiry date, you've taken action to extend your temporary resident status here, so that you're never here without any status. Now, other conditions of the study permit aren't as obvious, right? There's certain conditions that are implied onto the study permit, and they're not as well known, unfortunately, but you want to make sure you're keeping these in mind too, because they are just, or if not even more important than the ones that are listed there. You have to be enrolled at a designated learning institution. Okay, so when you come to Canada, you have your study permit, you have the ability to change schools. Okay, so let's say you do your first semester, the school isn't working out for you, or you don't like the program. You do have the ability to change programs. You do have the ability to change schools. But wherever you're changing schools, you want to ensure that your new school is still a designated learning institution. It is very important to understand that that study permit only gives you authorization to study at a DLI. Okay. The second implied condition is that you're actively pursuing your studies. And what this means is that you are constantly making progress towards the completion of your program. This is very, very important. Okay. While you're here on that study permit, you have to be actively pursuing your studies. You have to be making reasonable progress towards the completion of your program. Now, part-time studies can meet that requirement. So if you're a part-time student, yes, you are still considered to be actively pursuing your studies. However, this actually will pose a problem for your postgrad work permit application, and we'll talk about that in a moment as to why. If you are not studying, right? So we see that a requirement is that you're actively pursuing your studies. If you stop studying, your study permit actually becomes invalid 90 days after you stop studying. Okay, so the requirement is that you're actively pursuing your studies. The moment you stop studying, the moment you are no longer actively pursuing your studies, you have 90 days before your study permit becomes invalid. And this is irregardless of what the expiry date is on that study permit. So you can have a study permit valid for another 2 years, right? With an expiry date that's 2 years away. But if you stop studying before that, that study permit becomes invalid 90 days following the date that you stop studying. And this is also important to keep in mind if you finish your program early, right? So you could change programs, you might be taking a shorter program, you may have accelerated your studies and finished quicker than what was intended for the program. All of that is fine, but you have to keep in mind that that study permit becomes invalid 90 days after. And so for individuals who have finished their programs early, once you receive written confirmation that you have completed your program, and this can be your final grades, it can be a final transcript, a letter from the school, all of that triggers this 90-day timeline. So really important to keep that in mind once you're here. Now, the exceptions to this 90-day rule is if you're on a scheduled break or you're on an authorized leave. And I'll talk about authorized leave on the next slide, but scheduled break is a break that is part of your programs and your school's academic calendar. So it is not it's not a break that you've created for yourself. Okay, so for example, some master's programs here in Canada don't have summer breaks. So if you decide to create a summer break for yourself and take that time off, that's not a scheduled break. Okay, in those situations, you're looking for an authorized leave from your program. Now, an authorized leave has to be approved by the school itself. Okay, so you actually have to go to the school and ask for that authorized leave. You can't just decide on your own, again, that you want a summer off. And so, you've just decided to not enroll in courses for that summer. That's a problem. If you want to take a leave for whatever reason, you do need to get approval from the school itself. And my recommendation to all my clients is that where you're looking to do an authorized leave, keep a paper trail with that school. Get that written authorization from your school so that later on, if you have to be able to demonstrate that you've complied with your study permit conditions and that you did have an authorized leave, you want to be able to show that the school did approve that. Any authorized leave, the maximum time that you can take on an authorized leave is 150 days. So the total time cannot be longer than 150 days. If your leave is longer than 150 days for whatever reason, and you're remaining in Canada, then you do need to change your status. Okay, so if you have a study permit, you're here, you've taken an authorized leave, and you're remaining in Canada, you want to think about either changing your status to visitor or worker. Right, these are the other two types of temporary residence, like we talked about initially in the overview. You have to change your status if you're here beyond the 150 days. After the 150 days, you no longer have valid status on that study permit. And the other aspect is that you cannot work on your study permit if you're on an authorized leave. Okay, so your study permit does allow you to work, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But if you're on an authorized leave, you're not able to work at all using your study permit. So let's talk when you can work, right? The study permit itself does allow full-time post-secondary students to work both on campus and off campus, okay, as long as they are a full-time student. Okay, so that study permit allows you to work both on and off campus. So we're going to first look at the on-campus roles. So on campus is any facility that is within the boundaries of the school, of the campus that you're studying at. If the school has more than one campus, you can work at the different locations on those campuses as long as they're within the same municipality. Okay, and with the on-campus work, there's actually no maximum number of hours that you can work. Okay, and the reason I say that, and we'll talk about that with off-campus work where there is a maximum number of hours so there's a restriction on the number of hours that you can work. On campus, you can work unlimited number of hours, okay? Off campus, again, you can work without a work permit. It's still only for full-time students who hold a valid study permit. You have to be enrolled at a designated learning institution, and you have to be in a program that's at least 6 months long. Okay, so these particular individuals are able to work up to 20 hours a week during the school year and full-time during any regularly scheduled break. And this goes back to the same definition that we talked about earlier when we said a scheduled break, okay? It's, again, not one that you've created for yourself, but it is a part of both the schools and the program that you're studying in, both of their academic calendars, right? So generally, for example, bachelor degree programs are 2 semesters. So your fall and winter semester, and then your summer semesters are off. That summer semester is when you'd be able to work full time. In your final semester here, you can work as long as you have studied full time throughout your entire program, but you only require, if in that final semester, you only require a part-time course load in order to complete your program requirements, then you are still able to work part-time, even though you're only a part-time student. So that's one of the exceptions that we have in the requirement of being a full-time student. You must stop working though. So you can work on your study permit, both on and off campus, from the time that you've started your program to the point where you have received written confirmation that you have completed the requirements of your program. So if you arrive in Canada before, let's say you arrive a month early, right, before your program starts, that first month where you're not actively studying, you can't work, okay? You can begin working once you have actually begun your program. You can continue working up to the point in time where you have received written confirmation that you've completed your program of study or you've stopped studying. At that point, you're no longer able to work on that study permit. The next step for international students, generally when they're looking at moving towards the permanent residence, is the post-graduation work permit. This is a huge, huge benefit for international students who have completed a program of study here in Canada. A post-graduation work permit is an open work permit that allows students to, or I guess recent graduates, to work in any occupation anywhere in Canada. So there's very little restrictions in terms of what you can do using that post-graduation work permit. And this is, like I said, an important step to applying for your permanent residence. To qualify for that post-grad work permit, very important criteria. You have to have completed a program at an eligible designated learning institution, and that program needs to have been at least 8 months in length. Now, when we say an eligible designated learning institution, this is a little bit different than the list of eligible DLIs for your study permit, okay? And this is really important for you to think about now when you're applying, or when you're looking at schools and applying for your study permit itself. The reason being is that when you go onto IRCC's website and you pull up the list of designated learning institutions, the last column on the right indicates which designated learning institutions offer programs where you will qualify for the post-graduation work permit. So when you're looking at that DLI list, if that last column says no, that means that when you complete your program of study at that particular school, you will not be eligible for a post-graduation work permit. And like I said, this is an important step for international students who are looking to apply for permanent residence down the line. So when you're considering schools, when you're thinking about what programs, you want to take a look also at the designated learning institutions list, and particularly at that last column, to ensure that that last column says yes. Okay, because if you finish a program at a school that's not eligible, you won't be eligible for the postgrad work permit either. In every semester of your program here in Canada, you do have to have full-time status. Okay, and very important, I'm emphasizing every semester. Okay, can't tell you the number of times clients will come after they finish their program and they'll tell me, well, you know, I wasn't able to take a full-time course load in 3 of my semesters or 2 of my semesters. I just thought that I wanted to take a little bit of a break. I wanted to continue studying, but I wasn't able to take a full-time course load. That can be problematic for your eligibility criteria. Okay, if you have taken a part-time course load in any of your semesters, that may disqualify you from the postgrad work permit. So really important to be thinking about ensuring what that what full-time status means for your school, and two, that while you're here in every semester, you do maintain that full-time status. The exceptions to this are if you're on an authorized leave, if you're in your final semester, or if you're already here studying and your classes have been canceled because of COVID. So, you know, I get students who, for medical reasons, for example, need to take a break from school or do want to have a reduced course load. That can be problematic, right, for your postgrad work permit. And so in some cases, it's actually better to take an authorized leave than to take a part-time course load, okay? With that postgrad work permit, you do have to apply within 180 days of finishing your program. A study permit is not generally required at the time of your application. You can apply as long as you had a study permit within the 180 days prior to the submission of your application, okay? But if you are applying from inside of Canada, you do need to have valid status. And so again, here's where that 90 days comes up, okay? When you're thinking about applying for the postgrad work permit, it's important to know that you can only get it once in your lifetime. Okay, it's like a unicorn, only comes up once. And so it's really important to be ensuring that you're using that time on that postgrad work permit well, right? Getting that work experience that you need so that you can apply for permanent residence. The length of your postgrad work permit will also coincide with the length of your program. So again, something else to think about when you're selecting programs and you're selecting schools. If your program is anywhere between 8 months to 2 years, then your postgrad work permit will be valid for that same period of time. So for example, if you've done a 1-year program, you'll be eligible for a 1-year postgrad work permit. Now, if your program is 2 years or longer, then you'll be eligible for the maximum duration of the postgrad work permit, which is 3 years. Now, with that in mind, if you finished a 1-year program, for example, you could combine multiple programs together, right? So instead of doing 2 years in one program, you can also do 2 1-year programs, combine that together and still be eligible for the 3-year postgrad work permit. Both programs do need to qualify though, in terms of the eligibility criteria that we talked about in the previous slide. When we were talking about working off campus, we said that you had to stop working as soon as you received written confirmation that you had completed your program. But as soon as you have applied for your postgrad work permit, you may be eligible to start working full-time, okay? And one other thing I do want to note with the postgrad work permit is that online classes, so any sort of distance learning, can be problematic for your eligibility, okay? Now, the general rule is that if the distance learning, so if the online courses make up less than 50%, then you could still be eligible. The length of the postgrad work permit, though, would match the length of the program, including both your in-class and online classes. But any time that you've spent outside of Canada will be deducted from the length of that postgrad work permit. Okay, so important to think about that. If you're doing your online courses, if that percentage makes up more than 50% of your program, then you won't be eligible at all for the postgrad work permit. Now, again, these are the general rules. With COVID, we have seen exceptions being made. So right now, online courses don't necessarily affect the eligibility of the postgrad work permit if you're still in Canada. If you're outside of Canada, and you've started your program between spring of 2020 and fall of 2021, and you have either a study permit or you've been approved for one, you may still qualify for the postgrad work permit. In these situations, IRCC is allowing for students to complete up to 100% of their program online from outside of Canada and still be eligible. But they're only looking at education done. Right now, they're only looking at the studies that you've done up to December 31st, 2021. So, you know, we may see this being extended again. It has been extended in the past, but again, this is a moving thing because of COVID. So something to keep in mind, but it will depend on when you're looking to start your program. Next steps. Have a plan, right? Have an immigration plan, know what your goals are, know what you're trying to, what your long-term goal is in terms of immigration here in Canada, and, you know, make sure that you're working towards it at every step. Don't wait until, you know, you've graduated. When you're here, don't wait until you've graduated, just start thinking about applying for permanent residence. Think about it in advance. And when you're here, make sure that you stay in status, right? So we talked about how your study permit can become invalid. We talked about the conditions that are associated with your study permit. We talked about the expiry dates on your status documents. Keep all of that in mind, okay? Because while you're here, you want to make sure that you are in status. And very important, very, very important, do not misrepresent yourself, okay? Number of times I have clients that come to me when we're doing their permanent residence applications or we're doing further applications, and they'll tell me that, hey, I was advised by the previous professional that I had hired to do my study permit application that I should say on my application that I, did X, Y, or Z. But the reality is that I never did. Well, that can be problematic for your future here. Okay, very, very important. If you take one thing away, make sure you do not misrepresent yourself on your applications. There is a huge penalty that comes with misrepresentation. If IRCC finds that you have misrepresented yourself on your application, it can carry with it a 5-year ban entirely from future applications and from traveling to Canada. Okay, and then even after those 5 years, your application is going to be highly scrutinized, right? Because you do have this history. And you have to understand that IRCC does have information sharing agreements, right? So if you've been refused, for example, a visa in the States, or if you've been refused a previous visa to Canada, disclose that on your application, right? Address it, deal with it in your application. Don't hide that fact, because if it comes up and you get caught for misrepresentation, that is a huge problem and very hard to deal with, okay? If you do have a refusal, you apply for your study permit, you do everything right, and you're still refused, it does happen, but contact a lawyer right away, okay? Because there are very specific deadlines as to when you have to do certain things. So really important to keep that in mind. And then if you are applying for what's called a reconsideration, so your application's been refused and now you want to try and fix it, you can only ask for up to one reconsideration. So people will come to me and they'll say, well, I called IRCC's call center, or I tried to email them and I tried to ask for them to look at it again. Well, you only can do that once, right? So after you've tried to do it, then it becomes more difficult for a professional then to come in, or for a lawyer to come in and to try and overturn that. So keep in mind, as soon as you do have a refusal, if it does happen, unfortunately, contact a lawyer so they can guide you as to your next steps. And that's it. So I think we'll Sohail, are you still there? We can open it up now to questions.
Sure, Zia. Thank you so much for such an engaging presentation. Am I audible, Zia?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we can hear
Yes,
you.
Zia. So as always, the chat box is buzzing with a lot of questions, and I'm going to club a few questions and pick up the ones which are repeating, and I'm trying to club them together. The first, I see a common question. If you could elaborate a little on the SDS versus the non-SDS route for students, and what are the various pros and cons of each of the routes. So there is a common question coming across. So if you could elaborate a bit on this.
Yeah, so the SDS stream basically came out to be a faster way of getting a decision, right? So one of the issues sometimes with the study permit applications is that the processing times can be very long, and it becomes problematic to know whether you're going to have a decision in time for the start of your program. So the SDS stream, the biggest benefit of it is that the general processing time for applicants through the SDS stream is 20 days. And so, the reason IRCC can do this, though, is because they require more documents up front with your initial application. And so the idea is that you have more work to do in the preparation of your application, but generally then your processing is done quicker, right? And so one of the biggest benefits of that SDS stream is that you're getting a decision within 20 days. Now, we looked at the additional documents that are required for being able to apply through the Student Direct stream. And so those are like the GIC documents, the language test, which might not even be a requirement at all for some applicants, depending on where they're applying from. So there's the con is really your additional work that you have to do in advance, but the benefit is ensuring that you have a decision, or generally having a decision much faster.
Sure, thanks for that, Zia. Another common question coming, which I know you touched upon it, but if you could again elaborate on uh, taking family members. So specifically, if somebody wants to take his parents there, or his father, to help him get settled there, or if you have a sibling that you want to take, into the country, or a handicapped dependent, what's the status for these kind of scenarios?
Yeah, so when we're talking about accompanying family members, right? So people who can apply with you at the same time, basically you're all applying in that one application. IRCC looks at your spouse and your dependent children. Okay, parents, grandparents, siblings, all of this is outside of that family unit, right? That immediate family unit that IRCC looks at. And I know this might be a little different than the way we think of it culturally. However, IRCC is looking at spouses and dependent children as being part of your application, right? So we see the provisions there for spouses to get an open spousal work permit, and for dependent children to get study permits or visitor visas, so that you can all stay here together and ensure that that immediate family, at least, is staying united here in Canada. Now, for parents who want to come, for example, to drop their children off, help them get settled, they would have to apply separately, right? So you're not applying within that one application, but they would have to basically disclose that they're applying for a visitor visa for the purposes of dropping off their child and helping them settle here in Canada. Same thing for siblings. But it is a separate visitor visa application, or it is a separate application entirely. And so you're looking at that sibling, that parent's individual ability to apply for a visitor visa or another type of temporary status so that they can accompany here to Canada. But they're not part of the definition of immediate family member that IRCC is looking for, and that IRCC provides special provisions for.
Sure, thanks, Zia. There's a question from Arman Velani. He says, if you accelerate your course, from maybe 2 years to 1.4 years, or you accelerate it from 4 terms to 3 terms, does it still make you eligible for 3 years of PGWP?
Yes, that is a great question. So when we're looking at the length of the when we're looking at the length of the postgrad work permit, it is based on the length of the program. It's not based on how long it took you to complete that program. So if you do a 2-year program in a year, or you do a 2-year program in a year and a half, you're still eligible for that full 3-year postgrad work permit.
Great, thanks. Another question from Janil Gilani, who is an IB student, an international baccalaureate student. IB students usually apply for the study permit in mid-July after they have their final IBDP grades. This year, they have been asked to apply early due to the COVID-19 situation. So, what grades do they submit in the application, and will the IB predicted grades given by his school, which is Aga Khan Academy, and his IBM YP transcript, will that be accepted as a proof for applying for a study permit?
So, I mean, IRCC does understand like right now they're asking people to apply by May for September intake, right? And so I think it is understood that you may not have final grades at that point, but how IRCC is dealing with specifically this year, I mean, they haven't really disclosed it, but certainly in the past, it's been generally okay to provide interim transcripts and interim grades, but you do need to actually complete the program for both, usually for acceptance, for final acceptance into the school, and for that study permit itself.
Sure, thank you. Another question, unfortunately, it's anonymous, but the question is, he's been an exchange student to Canada for a year in 2012. So when he applies for a visa again, will that exchange student, the fact that he was an exchange student in the past, will that act as an intent of following the Canadian immigration laws when he applies for the visa again?
I mean, we don't, yes, like it does, any travel history does help, right? So again, if you have traveled outside of your country of citizenship in the past and you have complied with immigration rules, then certainly it does assist your application, right? I can't speak specifically to particular circumstances because it is certainly bigger than just looking at one aspect of an application in a silo. But yes, when we're talking about being able to demonstrate intent to comply with immigration rules, we're looking at different aspects of an individual's background, including their travel history, because that's one way to demonstrate that you will in the future comply by looking at the past compliance history.
Great, thank you. Another interesting question from Kaz Hussaini, who is basically from Afghanistan, but is currently living in India, holding a refugee status. So his question is the process route would be the same as an Indian citizen, or would it be different?
So this becomes difficult because when you're applying right now, your status is technically the process is the same. Technically, you can apply online, you can follow the same process, but when an officer is evaluating the application, it's going to be more difficult to meet the burden that the officer is looking for when they're evaluating, right? So specifically looking at intent to comply with immigration rules, generally that can be problematic where you're currently on refugee status. So yeah, usually it may not be the best option to be applying for temporary residence. But again, right now it's difficult to answer specific questions on an individual circumstances. I always recommend when you're looking for your own immigration plan, when you're looking to determine how to best apply for within a particular set of circumstances, you want to speak with a professional. So contact a lawyer, go through the background, and really prepare an individualized immigration plan with that lawyer so that they can really ensure that it's tailored to your specific circumstances and your background, right? So they're setting you up for the best chances of success. But yes, generally, when you're looking at someone who is on a refugee status, it does become more difficult to apply for temporary residence here in Canada.
Sure. Another question, are blended learning programs, which is a combination of partly online and partly on campus, are these kind of programs eligible for study visa and for a post-graduation work permit?
So they can be, right? We did talk about this when we looked at the post-grad work permit. So the study permit, yes, you would still be eligible as long as there's a portion in class. The post-grad work permit is where it can become difficult. So if the program is more than 50% online, then no, you would not be eligible for a post-grad work permit. If it's less than 50% online, then yes, you're still eligible for the post-grad work permit. If you completed all those online studies while you were in Canada, then the length of your postgrad work permit will still be correlated to the length of the program. But if you completed any part of that online portion outside of Canada, then the period of time that you were outside of Canada will be deducted from the length of your postgrad work permit.
Sure. Another question from Sajjad Nurani. If you apply basis an offer letter from one university and you subsequently receive an offer from a better university after you have submitted your visa application, can you amend your visa to change the university after submission?
This is another great question. So it depends on where your application process is at. So if you have submitted your application and you have not yet received a decision, then you can update the application that's in process with the new acceptance letter. So basically you would be letting IRCC know that you applied with the first school, you're now intending to change schools and go to a different program, and you've already been accepted into that second program. And so you update your application. In the event that you've already been approved, right? So you've applied, you've been approved, and you have not yet traveled to Canada. In that situation, you actually have to apply for a new study permit. So you have to submit your application and go through that process all over again with the new acceptance letter. Now, if you're already in Canada, and I think we talked about this earlier, but if you're already in Canada and you want to switch schools or switch programs, that's okay. You don't have to go and get a new study permit after you've already arrived in Canada. but you do need to notify IRCC that you have switched schools, that you've switched to a new designated learning institution by updating your school on your MyCSC account.
Sure, thanks. There are 3 or 4 questions which I'm combining, which is related to the minimum bank balance required to be shown while applying for the visa. So, a couple of the questions here. First is what is typically the minimum amount one needs to show? Second, if the student is not the holder, I mean, the parents are the joint account holders of that term deposit, how does that work? And typically, how long do you have to show that deposit in your account?
Okay, so we'll start with the first one. In terms of the amount, it depends on the school and the program, right? So your tuition fees that are required, and it also depends on the size of your family. So in terms of the tuition fees, you have to be able to show that you can afford at least the first year of tuition fees, and that you can, and then again, depending on the size of your family, you're looking at different living expenses. So tuition fees plus living expenses is what equals the amount that you have to be able to demonstrate. 10,000 is for yourself, 4,000 is for your first accompanying family member, and then it's 3,000 after that for each accompanying family member. So if it's just, I think the example we gave earlier was if your tuition is 15,000 for the first year, then you're looking at 15,000 for tuition, 10,000 for yourself, and 4,000 for an accompanying spouse, right? So 15, 10 to 25 plus the 4, so 29,000 would be the total that I would need to be able to demonstrate for year one. And then the second part of it is ensuring that you're able to demonstrate that there's a reasonable prospect of obtaining, of being able to afford future years of your program. So if you're doing a 2-year program, then you'd be able to afford that second year of studies here in Canada. For individuals whose families are assisting them financially, that's completely fine. The reality is that sometimes we do need the help of our parents, and that's okay. But where your parents are supporting you, you do want to be able to show that they can then, they will be able to provide the financial resources that you need in order to study. And still, you have to be able to demonstrate that same amount. And so where families are providing assistance, you want to show again that they are able to. So if it's their letter of employment, if it's their financial accounts that they're providing statements for, it just depends on what your situation is. But again, it has to be very clear to an officer that there is the financial resources that have been committed for that student to come here and study in Canada.
Sure. We are almost at the top of the hour, so we'll take the last 2 questions. There's a question from Shelina Hirji. At present, IRCC has maintained that complete visa, including biometric and medicals, will be processed, and the results will be announced by 6th of August. So how does it work out for late applicants, or if you are waiting for your loan from the bank to be processed, or if you haven't received the final semester exam details? How would it work for those cases?
Yeah, so IRCC is saying that any applications received after May 15th, they will do their best to process in time for the fall semester, but they don't know for sure that they will have a decision for you before fall starts. So it's really just going to depend on their processing capacities.
Sure. So there are still a lot of questions. So I'm kind of just okay. There's one question here which I think is again something on the top of the mind for everybody, and especially given that you are aware of the situation with vaccines in India. So is getting vaccinated mandatory before you land in Canada? And if you have a Covaxin which is approved by Indian government but not approved by WHO, how does it work in that scenario? And this is the case in US as well. So we are having a lot of students with questions related to the vaccination and their status.
So right now, there is no requirement from IRCC to be vaccinated fully before you travel to Canada. Now, we're still in May, so we may see some different rules come in before September. But as of right now, there's no requirement that you are completely vaccinated before traveling to Canada. With that in mind, the schools do have the ability to set their own rules on top of this, and so or the schools and provinces. So that might be something to double check with the school, particularly that you're traveling to or starting to study in. But from immigration, from IRCC's point of view right now, from the government standpoint, there's no requirement.
Great, Sia, and thank you. I think the Q&A box is still buzzing with a lot of questions. And to all the speakers, to all the participants on the call, I can see a lot of questions related to the scholarship and the financing options, as well as to what type of courses to go for. So I've just put a couple of links in the chat box, which is there's also a link to a Telegram group called Career Spark, where we will be uploading the webinars and the slide decks from the previous sessions. So do go through those, and I'm sure that will answer a lot of your questions. If that still doesn't answer your questions, we have a career help desk for any career specific queries, as well as a specific help desk for specifically related to studying in Canada. So please do put your queries in that and give us about a week's time, and we will revert back to you. And it's close to 9:30 here again. So once again, a very big thank you to you, Zia, for giving us your time. Extremely insightful session, and a lot of nuances you covered, which are not we are not aware of as students or parents applying in India. So really appreciate your time, and also a big thank you to the entire AKB Canada team for giving us your time for this collaboration. And participants, last but not the least, thanks to all of you. Thanks for joining and coming back for the sessions. And with that, I'll say good night and Yali Madat. And do take care of yourself. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you. Yali Madat.
Thank you, Yalimadat.